The Memoirs of William Tecumseh Sherman, Chapter 3, Early Recollections of California, continued, 1849 to 1850. The department headquarters still remained at Monterey, but, with the few soldiers, we had next to nothing to do. In midwinter we heard the approach of a battalion of the 2nd Dragoons under Major Lawrence Pike Graham, with Captains Rutger, Kautz, Campbell, and others along. So exhausted were they by their long march from Upper Mexico that we had to send relief to meet them as they approached. When this command reached Los Angeles, it was left there as the garrison, and Captain A.J. Smith's company of the 1st Dragoons was brought up to San Francisco. We were also advised that the 2nd Infantry, Colonel B. Riley, would be sent out around Cape Horn in sailing ships, that the Mounted Rifles, under Lieutenant Colonel Loring, would march overland to Oregon, and that Brigadier General Percifer F. Smith would come out in chief command of the Pacific coast. It was also known that a contract had been entered into with parties in New York and New Orleans for a monthly line of steamers from those cities to California via Panama. Lieutenant Colonel Burton had come up from Lower California, and, as captain of the 3rd Artillery, he was assigned to Company F, 3rd Artillery, at Monterey. Captain Warner remained at Sacramento, surveying, and Halleck, Murray, Ord, and I boarded with Donna Augustias. The season was unusually rainy and severe, but we passed the time with the usual round of dances and parties. The time fixed for the arrival of the mail steamer was understood to be about January 1st, 1849, but the day came and went without any tidings of her. Orders were given to Captain Burton to announce her arrival by firing a national salute, and each morning we listened for the guns from the fort. The month of January passed, and the greater part of February, too. As was usual, the army officers celebrated the 22nd of February with a grand ball given in the new stone schoolhouse, which Alcalde Walter Colton had built. It was the largest and best hall then in California. The ball was really a handsome affair, and we kept it up nearly all night. The next morning we were at breakfast, present Donna Augustias and Manuelita, Halleck, Murray, and myself. We were dull and stupid enough until a gun from the fort aroused us. Then another and another. "The steamer!" exclaimed all, and without waiting for hats or anything, off we dashed. I reached the wharf hatless, but the Donna sent my cap after me by a servant. The white puffs of smoke hung around the fort, mingled with the dense fog, which hid all the water of the bay, and well out to sea could be seen the black spars of some unknown vessel. At the wharf I found a group of soldiers and a small rowboat, which belonged to a brig at anchor in the bay. Hastily ordering a couple of willing soldiers to get in and take the oars, and Mr. Larkin and Mr. Hartnell asking to go along, we jumped in and pushed off, steering our boat toward the spars, which loomed up above the fog clear and distinct. In about a mile we came to the black hull of the strange monster, the long-expected and most welcome steamer California. Her wheels were barely moving, for her pilot could not see the shoreline distinctly, though the hills and point of pines could be clearly made out over the fog, and occasionally a glimpse of some white walls showed where the town lay. A Jacob's ladder was lowered for us from the steamer, and in a minute I scrambled up on deck, followed by Larkin and Hartnell, and we found ourselves in the midst of many old friends. There was Canby, the adjutant general, who was to take my place, Charlie Hoyt, my cousin, General Percifer F. Smith and wife, Gibbs, his aide-de-camp, Major Ogden, of the engineers, and wife, and indeed many old Californians, among them Alfred Robinson and Frank Ward, with his pretty bride. By the time the ship was fairly at anchor, we had answered a million of questions about gold and the state of the country, and, learning that the ship was out of fuel, had informed the captain, Marshall, that there was an abundance of pine wood, but no willing hands to cut it, that no man could be hired at less than an ounce of gold a day, unless the soldiers would volunteer to do it for some agreed-upon price. As for coal, there was not a pound in Monterey, or anywhere else in California. Vessels with coal were known to be en route around Cape Horn, but none had yet reached California. The arrival of this steamer was the beginning of a new epoch on the Pacific coast. Yet there she lay, helpless, without coal or fuel. The native Californians, who had never seen a steamship, stood for days on the beach looking at her, with the universal exclamation, "Tan feo!" How ugly! And she was truly ugly when compared with the clean, well-sparred frigates and sloop-of-wars that had hitherto been seen on the North Pacific coast. It was first supposed it would take 10 days to get wood enough to prosecute her voyage, and therefore all the passengers who could take up their quarters on shore. Major Canby relieved me, and took the place I had held so long as Adjutant General of the Department of California. The time seemed most opportune for me to leave the service, as I had several splendid offers of employment and of partnership, and accordingly I made my written resignation, but General Smith put his veto upon it, saying that he was to command the Division of the Pacific, while General Riley was to have the Department of California, and Colonel Loring that of Oregon. He wanted me as his Adjutant General, because of my familiarity with the country, and knowledge of its then condition. At the time, he had on his staff Gibbs as his aide-de-camp, and Fitzgerald as quartermaster. He also had along with him quite a retinue of servants, hired with a clear contract to serve for a whole year after reaching California, every one of whom deserted, except a young black fellow named Isaac. Mrs. Smith, a pleasant but delicate Louisiana lady, had a white maid-servant, in whose fidelity she had unbounded confidence. But this girl was married to a perfect stranger, and off before she had ever landed in San Francisco. It was therefore finally arranged that, on the California, I was to accompany General Smith to San Francisco as his Adjutant General. I accordingly sold some of my horses, and arranged for others to go up by land, and from that time I became fairly enlisted in the military family of General Persifer F. Smith. I parted with my old commander, Colonel Mason, with sincere regret. To me he had ever been kind and considerate, and, while stern, honest to a fault. He was the very embodiment of the principle of fidelity to the interests of the general government. He possessed a native strong intellect, and far more knowledge of the principles of civil government and law than he got credit for. In private and public expenditures, he was extremely economical, but not penurious. In cases where the officers had to contribute money for parties and entertainments, he always gave a double share, because of his allowance of double rations. During our frequent journeys, I was always caterer, and paid all the bills. In settling with him, he required a written statement of the items of account, but never disputed one of them. During our time, California was, as now, full of a bold, enterprising, and speculative set of men who were engaged in every sort of game to make money. I know that Colonel Mason was beset by them to use his position to make a fortune for himself and his friends, but he never bought land or town lots, because, he said, it was his place to hold the public estate for the government as free and unencumbered by claims as possible. And when I wanted him to stop the public land sales in San Francisco, San Jose, etc., he would not. Although he did not believe the titles given by the alcaldes worth a cent, yet they aided to settle the towns and public lands, and he thought, on the whole, the government would be benefited thereby. The same thing occurred as to the gold mines. He never took a title to a town lot, unless it was one, of no real value, from Alcalde Colton, in Monterey, of which I have never heard since. He did take a share in the store which Warner, Bester, and I opened at Coloma, paid his share of the capital, $500, and received his share of the profits, $1,500. I think also he took a share in a venture to China with Larkin and others, but, on leaving California, he was glad to sell out without profit or loss. In the stern discharge of his duty, he made some bitter enemies, among them Henry M. Nagley, who, in the newspapers of the day, endeavored to damage his fair fame. But knowing him intimately, I am certain that he is entitled to all praise for having so controlled the affairs of that country that, when his successor arrived, all things were so disposed that a civil form of government was an easy matter of adjustment. Colonel Mason was relieved by General Riley some time in April, and left California in the steamer of the 1st May for Washington and St. Louis, where he died of cholera in the summer of 1850, and his body is buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery. His widow afterward married Major, since General, Don Carlos Buell, and is now living in Kentucky. In overhauling the hold of the steamer California as she lay at anchor in Monterey Bay, a considerable amount of coal was found under some heavy duplicate machinery. With this, and such wood as she had gathered, she was able to renew her voyage. The usual signal was made, and we all went on board. About the 1st of March we entered the Heads, and anchored off San Francisco, near the United States line of battleship Ohio, Commodore T. App Catesby Jones. As was the universal custom of the day, the crew of the California deserted her, and she lay for months unable to make a trip back to Panama, as was expected of her. As soon as we reached San Francisco, the first thing was to secure an office and a house to live in. The weather was rainy and stormy, and snow even lay on the hills back of the mission. Captain Folsom, the quartermaster, agreed to surrender for our office the old adobe custom house on the upper corner of the plaza, as soon as he could remove his papers and effects down to one of his warehouses on the beach. And he also rented for us as quarters the old Hudson Bay Company House on Montgomery Street, which had been used by Howard and Mellis as a store, and at that very time they were moving their goods into a larger brick building just completed for them. As these changes would take some time, General Smith and Colonel Ogden, with their wives, accepted the hospitality offered by Commodore Jones on board the Ohio. I opened the office at the Custom House, and Gibbs, Fitzgerald, and some others of us slept in the loft of the Hudson Bay Company House until the lower part was cleared of Howard's store, after which General Smith and the ladies moved in. There we had a general mess, and the efforts at housekeeping were simply ludicrous. One servant after another, whom General Smith had brought from New Orleans, with a solemn promise to stand by him for 1 whole year, deserted without a word of notice or explanation, and in a few days none remained but little Isaac. The ladies had no maid or attendants, and the general, commanding all the mighty forces of the United States on the Pacific coast, had to scratch to get 1 good meal a day for his family. He was a gentleman of fine social qualities, genial and gentle, and joked at everything. Poor Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Ogden did not bear it so philosophically. Gibbs, Fitzgerald, and I could cruise around and find a meal which cost $3 at some of the many restaurants which had sprung up out of the redwood boards and cotton linens. But the general and ladies could not go out, for ladies were rara avis at that day in California. Isaac was cook, chambermaid, and everything, thoughtless of himself and struggling out of the slimmest means to compound a breakfast for a large and hungry family. The breakfast would be announced any time between 10 and 12, and dinner accordingly to circumstances. Many a time have I seen General Smith, with a can of preserved meat in his hands, going toward the house, take off his hat on meeting a negro, and, on being asked the reason of his politeness, he would answer that they were the only real gentlemen in California. I confess that the fidelity of Colonel Mason's boy, Aaron, and of General Smith's boy, Isaac, at a time when every white man laughed at promises as something made to be broken, he had given me a kindly feeling of respect for the negroes, and makes me hope that they will find an honorable status in the jumble of affairs in which we now live. That was a dull, hard winter in San Francisco. The rains were heavy and the mud fearful. I have seen mules stumble in the street and drown in the liquid mud. Montgomery Street had been filled with brush and clay, and I always dreaded to ride on horseback along it, because the mud was so deep that a horse's leg would become entangled in the bushes below, and the rider was likely to be thrown and drowned in the mud. The only sidewalks were made of stepping stones of empty boxes, and here and there a few planks with barrel staves nailed on. All the town lay along Montgomery Street from Sacramento to Jackson, and about the plaza. Gambling was the chief occupation of the people, while they were waiting for the cessation of the rainy season, and for the beginning of spring. All sorts of houses were being put up, but of the most flimsy kind, and all were stores, restaurants, or gambling saloons. Any room 20 by 60 would rent for $1,000 a month. I had as my pay $70 a month, and no one would even try to hire a servant under $300. Had it not been for the $1,500 I made in the store at Coloma, I could not have lived through the winter. About the 1st of April arrived the steamer Oregon, but her captain, Pearson, knew what was the state of affairs on shore, and ran his steamer alongside the line of battleship Ohio at Sausalito, and obtained the privilege of leaving his crew on board as prisoners until he was ready to return to sea. Then, discharging his prisoners and getting coal out of some of the ships which had arrived, he retook his crew out of limbo and carried the first regular mail back to Panama early in April. In regular order arrived the third steamer, the Panama, and as the vessels were arriving with coal, the California was enabled to hire a crew and get off. From that time forward, these 3 ships constituted the regular line of mail steamers, which has been kept up ever since. By the steamer Oregon arrived out Major R.P. Hammond, J.M. Williams, James Blair, and others. Also the gentlemen who, with Major Ogden, were to compose a joint commission to select the states for the permanent forts and navy yard of California. This commission was composed of Majors Ogden, Smith, and Ledbetter of the Army, and Captains Goldsborough, Van Brunt, and Blunt of the Navy. These officers, after a most careful study of the whole subject, selected Mare Island for the navy yard, and Benicia for the storehouses and arsenals of the army. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company also selected Benicia as their depot. Thus was again revived the old struggle for supremacy of these 2 points as the site of the future city of the Pacific. Meantime, however, San Francisco had secured the name. About 600 ships were anchored there without crews and could not get away, and there the city was and had to be. Nevertheless, General Smith, being disinterested and unprejudiced, decided on Benicia as the point where the city ought to be, and where the army headquarters should be. By the Oregon there arrived at San Francisco a man who deserves mention here, Baron Steinberger. He had been a great cattle dealer in the United States, and boasted that he had helped to break the United States Bank by being indebted to it $5 million. At all events, he was a splendid-looking fellow, and brought with him from Washington a letter to General Smith and another for Commodore Jones, to the effect that he was a man of enlarged experience in beef, that the authorities in Washington knew that there existed in California large herds of cattle which were only valuable for their hides and tallow, that it was of great importance to the government that this beef should be cured and salted so as to be of use to the army and navy, obviating the necessity of shipping salt beef around Cape Horn. I know he had such a letter from the Secretary of War, Marcy, to General Smith, for it passed into my custody, and I happened to be in Commodore Jones's cabin when the Baron presented the one for him from the Secretary of the Navy. The Baron was anxious to pitch it at once, and said that all he needed to start with were salt and barrels. After some inquiries of his purser, the Commodore promised to let him have the barrels with their salt, as fast as they were emptied by the crew. Then the Baron explained that he could get a nice lot of cattle from Don Timoteo Murphy, at the mission of San Rafael, on the north side of the bay, but he could not get a boat and crew to handle them. Under the authority from the Secretary of the Navy, the Commodore then promised him the use of a boat and crew, until he, the Baron, could find and purchase a suitable one for himself. Then the Baron opened the first regular butcher shop in San Francisco, on the wharf about the foot of Broadway or Pacific Street, where we could buy at 25 or 50 cents a pound the best roast steaks and cuts of beef, which had cost him nothing, for he never paid anybody if he could help it. And he sooner cleaned poor Don Timoteo out. At first, every boat of his, in coming down from the San Rafael, touched at the Ohio, and left the best beefsteaks and roasts for the Commodore, but soon the Baron had enough money to dispense with the borrowed boat, and set up for himself. And from this small beginning, step by step, he rose in a few months to be one of the richest and most influential men in San Francisco. But in his wild speculations he was at last caught, and became helplessly bankrupt. He followed General Fremont to St. Louis in 1861, where I saw him, but soon afterwards he died a pauper in one of the hospitals. When General Smith had his headquarters in San Francisco in the spring of 1849, Steinberger gave dinners worthy any baron of old, and when, in after years, I was a banker there, he used to borrow of me small sums of money in repayment for my share of these feasts, and somewhere among my old packages I hold one of his confidential notes for $200, but on the whole I got off easy. I have no doubt that, if this man's history could be written out, it would present phases as wonderful as any of romance, but in my judgment he was a dangerous man, without any true sense of honor or honesty. Little by little the rains of that season grew less and less, and the hills once more became green and covered with flowers. It became perfectly evident that no family could live in San Francisco on such a salary as Uncle Sam allowed his most favored officials. So General Smith and Major Ogden concluded to send their families back to the United States, and afterward we menfolks could take to camp and live on our rations. The 2nd Infantry had arrived, and had been distributed, 4 companies to Monterey, and the rest somewhat as Stevenson's regiment had been. A.J. Smith's company of dragoons was sent up to Sonoma, whither General Smith had resolved to move our headquarters. On the steamer which sailed about May 1st, I think the California, we embarked, the ladies for home and we for Monterey. At Monterey we went on shore, and Colonel Mason, who meantime had been relieved by General Riley, went on board, and the steamer departed for Panama. Of all that party, I alone am alive. General Riley had, with his family, taken the house which Colonel Mason had formerly used, and Major Canby and his wife had secured rooms at Alvarado's. Captain Kane was quartermaster, and had his family in the house of a man named Garner, near the redoubt. Burton and Company F were still at the fort. The 4 companies of the 2nd Infantry were quartered in the barracks, the same building in which we had our headquarters, and the company officers were quartered in hired buildings nearby. General Smith and his aide, Captain Gibbs, went to Larkin's house, and I was at my old rooms at Donna Augustias. As we intended to go back to San Francisco by land and afterward to travel a good deal, General Smith gave me the necessary authority to fit out the party. There happened to be several trains of horses and mules in town, so I purchased about a dozen horses and mules at $200 a head, on account of the quartermaster's department, and we had them kept under guard in the quartermaster's corral. I remember one night being in the quarters of Lieutenant Alfred Sully, where nearly all the officers of the garrison were assembled, listening to Sully's stories. Lieutenant Derby, Squeebob, was one of the number, as also Fred Steele, Neighbor Jones, and others, when, just after tattoo, the orderly sergeants came to report the result of tattoo roll call. One reported 5 men absent, another 8, and so on, until it became certain that 28 men had deserted, and they were so bold and open in their behavior that it amounted to defiance. They had deliberately slung their knapsacks and started for the gold mines. Dr. Murray and I were the only ones present who were familiar with the country, and I explained how easy they could all be taken by a party going out at once to Salinas Plain, where the country was so open and level that a rabbit could not cross without being seen, that the deserters could not go to the mines without crossing that plain, and could not reach it before daylight. All agreed that the whole regiment would desert if these men were not brought back. Several officers volunteered on the spot to go after them, and, as the soldiers could not be trusted, it was useless to send any but officers in pursuit. Someone went to report the affair to the Adjutant General, Canby, and he to General Riley. I waited some time, and, as the thing grew cold, I thought it was given up, and went to my room and to bed. About midnight I was called up and informed that there were 7 officers willing to go, but the difficulty was to get horses and saddles. I went down to Larkin's house and got General Smith to consent that we might take the horses I had bought for our trip. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. before we were all mounted and ready. I had a musket, which I used for hunting. With this I led off at a canter, followed by the others. About 6 miles out, by the faint moon, I saw ahead of us in the sandy road some blue coats, and, fearing lest they might resist or escape into the dense bushes which lined the road, I halted and found with me Paymaster Hill, Captain N.H. Davis, and Lieutenant John Hamilton. We waited for some time for the others, Vi, Canby, Murray, Gibbs, and Sully, to come up, but as they were not in sight we made a dash up the road and captured 6 of the deserters, who were Germans, with heavy knapsacks on, trudging along the deep, sandy road. They had not expected pursuit, had not heard our horses, and were accordingly easily taken. Finding myself the senior officer present, I ordered Lieutenant Hamilton to search the men and then to march them back to Monterey, suspecting, as was the fact, that the rest of our party had taken the road that branched off a couple of miles back. Daylight broke, and we reached the Salinas River, 12 miles out, and there the trail was broad and fresh, leading directly out on the Salinas Plain. This plain is about 5 miles wide, and the ground becomes somewhat broken. The trail continued very plain, and I rode on at a gallop to where there was an old adobe ranch on the left of the road, with the head of a lagoon or pond close by. I saw 1 or 2 of the soldiers getting water at the pond, and others up near the house. I had the best horse and was considerably ahead, but on looking back could see Hill and Davis coming up behind at a gallop. I motioned to them to hurry forward, and turned my horse across the head of the pond, knowing the ground well, as it was a favorite place for shooting geese and ducks. Approaching the house, I ordered the men who were outside to go in. They did not know me personally, and exchanged glances, but I had my musket cocked, and, as the 2 had seen Davis and Hill coming up pretty fast, they obeyed. Dismounting, I found the house full of deserters, and there was no escape for them. They naturally supposed that I had a strong party with me, and when I ordered them to fall in, they obeyed from habit. By the time Hill and Davis came up, I had them formed in 2 ranks, the front rank facing about, and I was taking away their bayonets, pistols, etc. We disarmed them, destroying a musket and several pistols, and, on counting them, we found that we 3 had taken 18, which, added to the 6 first captured, made 24. We made them sling their knapsacks and begin their homeward march. It was near night when we got back, so that these deserters had traveled nearly 40 miles since Tattoo on the night before. The other party had captured 3, so that only 1 man had escaped. I doubt not this prevented the desertion of the bulk of the 2nd Infantry that spring, for at that time so demoralizing was the effect of the gold mines that everybody not in the military service justified desertion, because a soldier, if free, could earn more money in a day than he received per month. Not only did soldiers and sailors desert, but captains and masters of ships actually abandoned their vessels and cargoes to try their luck at the mines. Preachers and professors forgot their creeds and took to trade, and even to keep gambling houses. I remember that one of our regular soldiers, named Reese, in deserting stole a favorite double-barreled shotgun of mine, and when the orderly sergeant of the company Carson was going on furlough, I asked him when he came across Reese to try and get my gun back. When he returned, he told me that he found Reese and offered him $100 for my gun, but Reese sent me word that he liked the gun, and would not take $100 for it. Soldiers or sailors who could reach the mines were universally shielded by the miners, so that it was next to useless to attempt their recapture. In due season, General Percival Smith, Gibbs, and I, with some hired packers, started back for San Francisco, and soon after we transferred our headquarters to Sonoma. About this time Major Joseph Hooker arrived from the East. The regular adjutant general of the division relieved me, and I became thereafter one of General Smith's regular aide-de-camp. As there was very little to do, General Smith encouraged us to go into any business that would enable us to make money. R.P. Hammond, James Blair, and I made a contract to survey for Colonel J.D. Stevenson his newly projected city of New York of the Pacific, situated at the mouth of the San Joaquin River. The contract embraced also the making of soundings and marking out a channel through Suisun Bay. We hired, in San Francisco, a small metallic boat with a sail, laid in some stores, and proceeded to the United States ship Ohio, anchored at Sausalito, where we borrowed a sailor boy and lead lines, with which to sound the channel. We sailed up to Benicia, and at General Smith's request, we surveyed and marked the line dividing the city of Benicia from the government reserve. We then sounded the bay back and forth, and staked out the best channel up Suisun Bay, from which Blair made out sailing directions. We then made the preliminary surveys of the city of New York of the Pacific, all of which were duly plotted, and for this work we each received from Stevenson $500 and 10 or 15 lots. I sold enough lots to make another $500, and let the balance go. For the city of New York of the Pacific never came to anything. Indeed, cities at the time were being projected by speculators all round the bay and all over the country. While we were surveying at New York of the Pacific, occurred one of those little events that showed the force of the gold fever. We had a sailor boy with us, about 17 years old, who cooked our meals and helped work the boat. On shore we had the sail spread so as to shelter us against the wind and dew. One morning I awoke about daylight and looked out to see if our sailor boy was at work getting breakfast. But he was not at the fire at all. Getting up, I discovered that he had converted a tulbolsa into a sailboat and was sailing for the gold mines. He was astride this bolsa, with a small parcel of bread and meat done up in a piece of cloth. Another piece of cloth, such as we used for making our signal stations, he had fixed into a sail, and with a paddle he was directing his precarious craft right out into the broad bay, to follow the general direction of the schooners and boats that he knew were ascending the Sacramento River. He was about 100 yards from the shore. I jerked up my gun and hailed him to come back, after a moment's hesitation to let go his sheet, and began to paddle back. This bolsa was nothing but a bundle of tulle, or bulrush, bound together with grass ropes in the shape of a cigar, about 10 feet long and about 2 feet through the butt. With these the California Indians crossed streams of considerable size. When he came ashore, I gave him a good overhauling for attempting to desert, and put him to work getting breakfast. In due time we returned him to his ship, the Ohio. Subsequently, I made a bargain with Mr. Hartnell to survey his ranch at Cosumnes River, Sacramento Valley. Ord and a young citizen named Seton were associated with me in this. I bought of Rodman and Price a surveyor's compass, chain, etc., and in San Francisco a small wagon and harness. Availing ourselves of a schooner chartered to carry Major Miller and 2 companies of the 2nd Infantry from San Francisco to Stockton, we got up to our destination at little cost. I recall an occurrence that happened when the schooner was anchored in Carquinez Straits, opposite the soldiers' camp on shore. We were waiting for daylight and a fair wind. The schooner lay anchored at an ebb tide, and about daylight, Ord and I had gone ashore for something. Just as we were pulling off from shore, we heard the loud shouts of the men, and saw them all running down toward the water. Our attention thus drawn, we saw something swimming in the water, and pulled toward it, thinking it a coyote, but we soon recognized a large grizzly bear, swimming directly across the channel. Not having any weapon, we hurriedly pulled for the schooner, calling out as we neared it, "A bear! A bear!" It soon happened that Major Miller was on deck, washing his face and hands. He ran rapidly to the bow of the vessel, took the musket from the hands of the sentinel, and fired at the bear. As he passed but a short distance ahead of the schooner, the bear rose, made a growl, or howl, but continued his course. As we scrambled up the port side to get our guns, the mate, with a crew, happened to have a boat on the starboard side, and, armed only with a hatchet, they pulled up alongside the bear, and the mate struck him in the head with the hatchet. The bear turned, tried to get into the boat, but the mate struck his claws with repeated blows, and made him let go. After several passes with him, the mate actually killed the bear, got a rope around him, and towed him alongside the schooner, where he was hoisted on deck. The carcass weighed over 600 pounds. It was found that Major Miller's shot had struck the bear in the lower jaw, and thus disabled him. Had it not been for this, the bear would certainly have upset the boat and drowned all in it. As it was, however, his meat served us a good turn in our trip up to Stockton. At Stockton we disembarked our wagon, provisions, and instruments. There I bought 2 fine mules at $300 each, and we hitched and started for the Cosumnes River. About 12 miles off was the McCullamy, a wide, bold stream with a canoe as a ferry boat. We took our wagon to pieces and ferried it and its contents across, and then drove our mules into the water. In crossing, one mule became entangled in the rope of the other, and for a time we thought he was a gone mule. But at last he revived, and we hitched up. The mules were both pack animals. Neither had ever before seen a wagon. Young Seton also was about as green, and had never handled a mule. We put on the harness and began to hitch them in, when one of the mules turned his head, saw the wagon, and started. We held on tight, but the beast did not stop until he had shivered the tongue pole into a dozen fragments. The fact was that Seton had hitched the traces before he had put on the blind bridle. There was considerable swearing done, but that would not mend the pole. There was no place nearer than Sutter's Fort to repair damages, so we were put to our wits' end. We first sent back a mile or so, and bought a rawhide. Gathering up the fragments of the pole and cutting the hide into strips, we fished it in the rudest manner. As long as the hide was green, the pole was very shaky, but gradually the sun dried the hide, tightened it, and the pole actually held for about a month. This cost us nearly a day of delay, but when damages were repaired, we harnessed up again, and reached the crossing of the Cosumnes, where our survey was to begin. The expediente, or title papers, of the ranch described it as containing 9 or 11 leagues on the Cosumnes, south side, and between the San Joaquin River and the Sierra Nevada mountains. We began at the place where the road crosses the Cosumnes and laid down a line 4 miles south, perpendicular to the general direction of the stream. Then, surveying up the stream, we marked each mile so as to admit of a subdivision of 1 mile by 4. The land was dry and very poor, with great bulk of the bottom land occurring on the north side of the stream. We continued the survey up some 20 miles into the hills above the mill of Daler and Sheldon. It took about a month to make this survey, which, when finished, was duly plotted, and for it we received 1/10 of the land, or 2 subdivisions. Ord and I took the land, and we paid Seton for his labor in cash. By the sale of my share of the land, subsequently, I received $300. After finishing Hartnell's survey, we crossed over to Daler's, and did some work for him at $500 a day for the party. Having finished our work on the Cosumnes, we proceeded to Sacramento, where Captain Sutter employed us to connect the survey of Sacramento City made by Lieutenant Warner and that of Sutterville 3 miles below, which was then being surveyed by Lieutenant J.W. Davidson of the 1st Dragoons. At Sutterville, the plateau of the Sacramento approached quite near the river, and it would have made a better site for a town than the low, submerged land where the city now stands. But it seems to be a law of growth that all natural advantages are disregarded wherever one's business chooses a location. Old Sutter's Embarcadero became Sacramento City, simply because it was the first point used for unloading boats for Sutter's Fort, just as the site for San Francisco was fixed by the use of Yerba Buena as the hiding land for the mission of San Francisco de Aziz. I invested my earnings in this survey in 3 lots in Sacramento City, on which I made a fair profit by a sale to one McNulty of Mansfield, Ohio. I only had a 2 months' leave of absence, during which General Smith, his staff, and a retinue of civil friends were making a tour of the gold mines, and hearing that he was en route back to his headquarters at Sonoma, I knocked off my work, sold my instruments, and left my wagon and mules with my cousin Charlie Hoyt, who had a store in Sacramento and was on the point of moving up to a ranch, for which he had bargained, on Bear Creek, on which was afterward established Camp Far West. He afterward sold the mules, wagon, etc. for me, and on the whole I think I cleared, by those 2 months' work, about $600. I then returned to headquarters at Sonoma, in time to attend my fellow aide-de-camp Gibbs through a long and dangerous sickness, during which he was on board a store ship guarded by Captain George Johnson, who now resides in San Francisco. General Smith had agreed that on the first good opportunity he would send me to the United States as a bearer of dispatches, but this he could not do until he had made the examination of Oregon, which was also in his command. During the summer of 1849 there continued to pour into California a perfect stream of people. Steamers came, and a line was established from San Francisco to Sacramento, of which the senator was the pioneer, charging $16 a passage and actually coining money. Other boats were built, out of the materials which had either come around Cape Horn or were brought from the Sandwich Isles. Wharves were built, houses were springing up as if by magic, and the Bay of San Francisco presented as busy a scene of life as any part of the world. Major Allen, of the quartermaster's department, who had come out as chief quartermaster of the division, was building a large warehouse at Benicia, with a row of quarters out of lumber at $100 per 1,000 feet, and the work was done by men at $16 a day. I have seen a detailed soldier, who got only his monthly pay of $8 a month, and 20 cents a day for extra duty, nailing on weatherboards and shingles alongside a citizen who was paid $16 a day. This was a real injustice, made the soldiers discontented, and it was hardly to be wondered at that so many deserted, while the mass of people were busy at gold and in mammoth speculations. A set of busy politicians were at work to secure the prizes of civil government. Gwynn and Fremont were there, and T. Butler King, of Georgia, had come out from the East, scheming for office. He stayed with us at Sonoma, and was generally regarded as the government candidate for the United States Senator. General Riley as governor, and Captain Halleck as Secretary of State, had issued a proclamation for the election of a convention to frame a state constitution. In due time the elections were held, and the convention was assembled at Monterey. Dr. Semple was elected president, and Gwynn, Sutter, Halleck, Butler, King, Sherwood, Gilbert, Shannon, and others were members. General Smith took no part in this convention, but sent me down to watch the proceedings and report to him. The only subject of interest was the slavery question. There was no slaves then in California, save a few who had come out as servants, but the Southern people at that time claimed their share of the territory, out of that acquired by the common laborers of all sections of the Union in the war with Mexico. Still, in California there was little feeling on the subject. I never heard General Smith, who was a Louisian, express any opinion about it, nor did Butler King of Georgia ever manifest any particular interest in the matter. A committee was named to draft a constitution which in due time was reported, with the usual clause, then known as the Wilmot Proviso, excluding slavery, and during the debate which ensued very little opposition was made to this clause, which was finally adopted by a large majority, although the convention was made up in large part of men from our southern states. This matter of California being a free state afterward, in the National Congress, gave rise to angry debates, which at one time threatened civil war. The result of the convention was the election of state officers and of the legislation which sat in San Jose in October and November 1849, and which elected Fremont and Gwin as the first United States senators in Congress from the Pacific coast. Shortly after returning from Monterey, I was sent by General Smith up to Sacramento City to instruct Lieutenants Warner and Williamson of the engineers to push their surveys of the Sierra Nevada mountains for the purpose of ascertaining the possibility of passing that range by a railroad, a subject that then elicited universal interest. It was generally assumed that such a road could not be made along any of the immigrant roads then in use, and Warner's orders were to look farther north up the Feather River or some one of its tributaries. Warner was engaged in this survey during the summer and fall of 1849, and had explored, to the very end of Goose Lake, the source of Feather River. Then, leaving Williamson with the baggage and part of the men, he took about 10 men and a first-rate guide, crossed the summit to the east, and then turned south, having the range of mountains on his right hand, with the intention of regaining his camp by another pass in the mountain. The party was strung out single file, with wide spaces between, Warner ahead. He had crossed a small valley and ascended one of the spurs covered with sagebrush and rocks, when a band of Indians rose up and poured in a shower of arrows. The mule turned and ran back to the valley, where Warner fell off dead, punctured by 5 arrows. The mule also died. The guide, who was next to Warner, was mortally wounded, and 1 or 2 men had arrows in their bodies, but recovered. The party gathered about Warner's body, in sight of the Indians, who whooped and yelled, but did not venture away from their cover of rocks. This party of men remained there all day without burying the dead, and at night, by a wide circuit, passed the mountain, and reached Williamson's camp. The news of Warner's death cast a gloom over all the old Californians, who knew him well. He was a careful, prudent, and honest officer, well qualified for his business, and extremely accurate in all his work. He and I had been intimately associated during our 4 years together in California, and I felt his loss deeply. The season was then too far advanced to attempt to avenge his death, and it was not until the next spring that a party was sent out to gather and bury his scattered bones. As winter approached, the immigrants overland came pouring into California, dusty and worn with their 2,000 miles of wearied travel across the plains and mountains. Those who arrived in October and November reported thousands still behind them, with oxen perishing and short of food. Appeals were made for help, and General Smith resolved to attempt relief. Major Rucker, who had come across with Pike Graham's battalion of dragoons, had exchanged with Major Fitzgerald of the Quartermaster's Department, and was detailed to conduct this relief. General Smith ordered him to be supplied with $100,000 out of the civil fund, subject to his control, and with this to purchase at Sacramento flour, bacon, etc., and to hire men and mules to send out and meet the immigrants. Major Rucker fulfilled this duty perfectly, sending out pack trains loaded with food by the many routes by which the immigrants were known to be approaching, went out himself with one of these trains, and remained in the mountains until the last immigrant had got in. No doubt this expedition saved many a life, which has since been most useful to the country. I remained at Sacramento a good part of the fall of 1849, recognizing among the immigrants many of my old personal friends. John C. Fall, William King, Sam Stombaugh, Hugh Ewing, Hampton Denham, etc. I got Rucker to give these last 2 employment along with the train for the relief of the immigrants. They had proposed to begin a ranch on my land on the Cosumnes, but afterward changed their minds and went out with Rucker. While I was at Sacramento, General Smith had gone on his contemplated trip to Oregon and promised that he would be back in December, when he would send me home with dispatches. Accordingly, as the winter and rainy season was at hand, I went to San Francisco and spent some time at the Presidio, waiting patiently for General Smith's return. About Christmas, a vessel arrived from Oregon with the dispatches, and an order for me to deliver them in person to General Winfield Scott in New York City. General Smith had sent them down, remaining in Oregon for a time. Of course, I was already, and others of our set were going home by the same conveyance, viz., Rucker, Ord, A.J. Smith, some under orders and others on leave. Wanting to see my old friends in Monterey, I arranged for my passage in the steamer of January 1st, 1850, paying $600 for passage to New York, and went down to Monterey by land, Rucker accompanying me. The weather was unusually rainy, and all the plain about Santa Clara was under water, but we reached Monterey in time. I again was welcomed by friends, Donna Augustias, Manuelita, and the family, and it was resolved that I should take 2 of the boys home with me and put them at Georgetown College for education, viz. Antonio and Porfirio, 13 and 11 years old. The Donna gave me a bag of gold dust to pay for their passage and to deposit at the college. On the 2nd day of January, punctually appeared the steamer Oregon. We were all soon on board and off for home. At that time, the steamers touched at San Diego, Acapulco, and Panama. Our passage down the coast was unusually pleasant. Arrived at Panama, we hired mules and rode across the Gorgona, on the Cruces River, where we hired a boat and paddled down to the mouth of the river off which lay the steamer Crescent City. It usually took 4 days to cross the isthmus, every passenger taking care of himself, and it was really funny to watch the efforts of women and men unaccustomed to mules. It was an old song to us, and the trip across was easy and interesting. In due time we were rowed off to the Crescent City, rolling back and forth in the swell, and we scrambled aboard by a Jacob's ladder from the stern. Some of the women had to be hoisted aboard by lowering a tub from the end of a boom. Fun to us who looked on, but awkward enough to the poor women, especially to a very fat one, who attracted much notice. General Fremont, wife, and child, Lily, were passengers with us down from San Francisco, but Mrs. Fremont not being well, they remained over one trip at Panama. Senator Gwynn was one of our passengers, and went through to New York. We reached New York about the close of January, after a safe and pleasant trip. Our party, composed of Ord, A.J. Smith, and Rucker, with the 2 boys, Antonio and Porfirio, put up at Delmonico's, on Bowling Green, and as soon as we had cleaned up somewhat, I took a carriage, went to General Scott's office in 9th Street, delivered my dispatches, was ordered to dine with him next day, and then went forth to hunt my old friends and relations, the Scotts, Hoyts, etc., etc. On reaching New York, most of us had rough soldier's clothing, but we soon got a new outfit, and I dined with General Scott's family, Mrs. Scott being present, and also their son-in-law and daughter, Colonel and Mrs. H.L. Scott. The General questioned me pretty closely in regard to things on the Pacific coast, especially the politics, and startled me with the assertion that our country was on the eve of a terrible civil war. He interested me by anecdotes of my old army comrades in his recent battles around the city of Mexico, and I felt deeply the fact that our country had passed through a foreign war, that my comrades had fought great battles, and yet I had not heard a hostile shot. Of course, I thought it the last and only chance in my day, and that my career as a soldier was at an end. After some 4 or 5 days spent in New York, I was, by an order of General Scott, sent to Washington to lay before the Secretary of War, Crawford of Georgia, the dispatches which I brought from California. On reaching Washington, I found that Mr. Ewing was Secretary of the Interior, and I at once became a member of his family. The family occupied the house of Mr. Blair, on Pennsylvania Avenue, directly in front of the War Department. I immediately repaired to the War Department, and placed my dispatches in the hands of Mr. Crawford, who questioned me somewhat about California, but seemed a little interested in the subject, except so far as it related to slavery and the routes through Texas. I then went to call on the President at the White House. I found Major Bliss, who had been my teacher in mathematics at West Point, and was then General Taylor's son-in-law and private secretary. He took me into the room, now used by the President's private secretaries, where President Taylor was. I had not seen him before, though I had served under him in Florida in 1840-41, and was most agreeably surprised at his fine personal appearance, and his pleasant, easy manners. He received me with great kindness, told me that Colonel Mason had mentioned my name with praise, and that he would be pleased to do me any act of favor. We were with him nearly an hour, talking about California generally, and of his personal friends, Percifer Smith, Riley, Canby, and others. Although General Scott was generally regarded by the Army as the most accomplished soldier of the Mexican War, yet General Taylor had that blunt, honest, and stern character that endeared him to the masses of the people and made him president. Bliss, too, had gained a large fame by his marked skill and intelligence as an adjutant general and military adviser. His manner was very unmilitary, and in his talk he stammered and hesitated, so as to make an unfavorable impression on a stranger, but he was wonderfully accurate and skillful with his pen, and his orders and letters form a model of military precision and clearness.